Every evening after work, I would drive back to my own luxurious house. But one night, the company's janitor grabbed me in the parking garage and said in a trembling voice, "Don't go home tonight." I asked why, thinking he was joking. But then he said 5 words that nearly made me faint on the spot. Those exact 5 words exposed the complete truth about the person I loved most, and they saved my life. Hello everyone, welcome to today's story. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from. If a janitor suddenly stopped you and said, "Don't go home tonight," would you believe him or ignore it? Don't forget to like and subscribe. Note, this is a fictional story with meaningful insights. The elevator doors hissed open, and the freezing Chicago wind slapped me across the face, smelling of wet concrete and exhaust. Carl Morgan, the 61-year-old CEO of Morgan Logistics, stepped out of the glass-walled elevator, my tailored coat, barely shielding me from the biting Chicago wind. It had been a grueling 14-hour day, the kind that makes the joints ache and the mind wander toward the quiet comforts of a home I barely occupied. My footsteps echoed off the concrete pillars of the executive parking garage, a hollow rhythmic sound that seemed to mock the vastness of the empire I had spent decades building. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered with a tired industrial buzz, casting long, jagged shadows across the polished hood of my sedan. I paused for a moment, letting the silence settle around me. Just another night in the empire I built, I thought, adjusting my scarf. I was too old for these double shifts, but the logistics business waited for no one, not even the man whose name was etched in marble in the lobby 50 stories above. The air was thick with the scent of stale diesel fumes, a sharp contrast to the filtered cedar-scented oxygen of my office. I reached for my keys, the metal cold against my skin, and that was when the silence of the garage shifted. It wasn't a sound, but a presence, a ripple in the stillness that made the hair on my neck stand up. A shadow detached itself from the concrete supports near the ramp. I froze my hand, hovering over the door handle. Otis Henderson, 63, the head janitor whose face usually blended into the company's background, stood trembling in the shadows, his coveralls stained with sweat and urgency. When was the last time a man who cleans your floors risked his pension to grab you by the throat? Before I could ask what he was doing in the executive zone, Otis lunged forward. His calloused, grease-stained hands didn't go for my wallet. They gripped the thick wool of my coat with a desperation that nearly knocked me off balance. "Mr. Morgan, please." He rasped, his breath coming in ragged, terrified plumes. "Don't start the car. I've been waiting 2 hours to catch you alone." His eyes were wide, darting toward the black lenses of the security cameras, as if they were predatory birds. I tried to pull back, my heart hammering against my ribs, but his grip was like iron. "Otis, what is this?" I demanded, my voice cracking with a mixture of confusion and burgeoning panic. He leaned in, his face inches from mine, and the smell of industrial soap and raw fear was overwhelming. He didn't care about the protocol he was shattering, or the fact that he was physically restraining his employer. "It's about Pierce," he whispered, the name hitting me like a physical blow. "Your son." The mention of my boy, the son I hadn't spoken to in 6 long years, turned my blood to ice. My mind raced through 1,000 memories of a house once full of laughter and a relationship that had turned to ash. 6 years of silence, and it ends with a death sentence. Otis gripped my arm tighter, his voice a frantic hiss. "Don't go home tonight, Carl. If you go home, you won't see tomorrow." His warning wasn't just a vague threat. Otis was shaking as he specified that my own son, the boy I once tucked into bed, was the architect of whatever was coming for me tonight. I looked into Otis's eyes and saw not just fear, but the absolute certainty of a man who had seen my grave already dug. I fumbled with my keys 3 times before the ignition finally roared to life, my hands shaking so violently I nearly dropped the heavy key fob into the dark abyss beneath the seat. Otis was gone, vanished back into the service corridors of the garage, leaving me alone with the hum of the engine and a terror that felt like ice water in my veins. Before shifting into gear, I noticed a dull pulse of light from my briefcase. I reached in and pulled out my emergency-only burner phone, a device whose number only 3 people in the world possessed. There was a single missed call from an unknown number time-stamped, just minutes before Otis had physically blocked my path. The coincidence made my skin crawl. I sat there for a moment, my breath fogging the windshield, debating whether to call the police or dismiss the warning as the delusions of an overworked janitor. "It's just a janitor's tall tale, isn't it?" I whispered to the empty cabin. But he knew Pierce's name. How could he possibly know about a son I've treated like a buried secret for 6 years? Paranoia began to bleed into the edges of my vision. I checked the rearview mirror every few seconds, suddenly convinced that every concrete pillar in the garage hid a threat. Every shadow a messenger sent by the son I hadn't seen since our world shattered in 2018. I couldn't go home. I shifted the car into drive and steered toward the exit, but instead of turning toward the Gold Coast, I headed for a small, anonymous safe house apartment I keep for traveling executives in the loop. Fear is a parasite. It doesn't just eat your peace, it hollows out your logic until you're nothing but a shell of the man you used to be. As I navigated Lower Wacker Drive, the vibration of the steering wheel against my numb fingers felt like a death rattle. I pulled over a few blocks from the safe house, checking my personal phone for the 10th time. The screen was a black mirror, showing only the same cold silence that had defined my relationship with Pierce for half a decade. I'm a 61-year-old man hiding in the dark from my own blood. I thought a bitter, metallic taste of adrenaline rising in the back of my throat. I felt a wave of humiliation, a sense of being a fool for cowering in an alleyway right until the first siren wailed in the distance. The sound was a mournful howl that started at the edge of the skyline and rapidly multiplied. I stepped out of the car, my legs feeling like lead, and looked back toward the neighborhood where my historic brownstone stood. The night didn't just break. It shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces of orange glass. A single bright plume of orange smoke began to billow into the night sky, followed by a dull, heavy thump that rattled the windows of the buildings around me. It wasn't just a fire. It was a deliberate, accelerated explosion that tore through the upper floors where my bedroom was situated. My God, he actually did it. I whispered the air blocks away, suddenly smelling of scorched stone and vanished memories. That was my home, my sanctuary, and it was currently being consumed by a rage I had clearly underestimated. The orange glow reflected off my windshield wasn't just a fire. It was the funeral pyre of the man I thought I was, and the smoke carried the scent of my son's betrayal. Heat radiated from the pavement, a suffocating wall that pushed against my chest as I crossed the yellow police tape. The orange glow that had dominated the Chicago skyline was gone, replaced by the pale, ghostly light of a dawn I was never meant to see. I stood before the skeleton of my historic Gold Coast brownstone, watching the last embers die out like the final gasps of a dying beast. The air was thick with the acrid smell of sodden ash, charred oak, and the remnants of my library, thousands of ancient books, now reduced to gray flakes, drifting in the biting lakefront wind. "I'm the owner," I rasped to a young officer who tried to block my path. "I'm Carl Morgan." He stepped aside, his expression shifting from suspicion to a hollow kind of pity. Fire Chief Miller, a man with soot-streaked skin and eyes that had seen too many Chicago winters, pulled off his heavy gloves and looked at me with a pity that turned my blood to ice. He didn't offer a handshake. Instead, he pointed toward the street-level valve assembly. "You're a lucky man," Mr. Morgan Miller said, his voice as gravelly as the ruins. The fire suppression system, the most expensive on the market, had its water main shut off manually from the street an hour before ignition. If you'd been in that bed, you'd have been ash in 3 minutes. I felt the crunch of broken glass under my Italian leather shoes as I moved closer. The hiss of steam rising from the wet ruins sounded like 1,000 snakes. Miller followed me, his flashlight cutting through the gray morning mist to highlight the twisted remains of the smart home hub. This wasn't a surge, he continued, leaning in. It was a surgical strike. A sophisticated electrical override in the master suite system ignited the fire, while simultaneously deadbolting the electronic locks. It was timed for when a man like you would be in his deepest sleep. How do you grieve for a house when the person who tried to kill you is the one you used to call your greatest legacy? The cognitive dissonance was a physical weight, a pressure behind my eyes that made the world tilt. I stared at the scorched, empty rectangle of my bedroom window, seeing the grave I was supposed to occupy. Otis Henderson hadn't just given me a vague warning. That janitor had specific, actionable intel. A man I had barely looked at for years. A man whose last name I hadn't even bothered to memorize until last night had saved my life. The realization made me feel smaller than the ash beneath my feet. The truth was like the smoke, bitter gray and impossible to wash out of my skin. I watched a fire investigator pick through the debris of the front hall, his gloved hand reaching into the soot near the threshold. He stood up, holding a small, unburned metal object that caught the morning light. It was a high-end corporate keycard, the platinum tier kind, issued only to the top 3 executives at Morgan Logistics. It didn't belong to me, and my second in command was in London. As the investigator bagged the keycard, I realized the breach didn't come from a stranger in the night, but from the very heart of the empire I spent 30 years building. The betrayal wasn't hovering in the shadows. It was wearing a suit and sitting in my boardrooms. 30 years is a long time to build a lie, but it only takes a single spark to reveal that the foundation was made of nothing but ghosts. As I sat in the safe house, the sterile walls and unfamiliar furniture felt like a transition chamber between the man I was and the ash I had become. I closed my eyes, and the sounds of the Chicago Loop faded, replaced by the rhythmic, echoing silence of a hospital corridor in 1996. I hadn't gone to City Hospital that night to find a reason to live. In truth, I had gone there to finalize a donation to the new surgical wing in memory of my wife Sarah. The silence of the 4th floor was supposed to be my only companion, a sterile vacuum that mirrored the hollowness in my chest. I didn't just stumble upon the infant. Looking back, I realize I had been subconsciously searching for a way to replace the family I had just buried, making what happened next an act of survival for myself as much as the child. I walked past the administrative desks, my footsteps muffled by the smell of industrial bleach and baby powder when I heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound coming from the infant ward, a master ward for abandoned infants that should have been empty at that hour. I pushed the door open, drawn by a curiosity I hadn't felt in months. Inside, beneath the hum of flickering fluorescent lights, sat a single unadorned plastic bassinet. Infant Pierce, a tiny bundle of red-faced defiance and desperate lungs, lay in a plastic bassinet that seemed far too small for the destiny that awaited him. He was wrapped in a thin, scratchy hospital blanket, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. Pinned to the fabric was a scrap of paper that simply said, "Please." A nurse approached me, her face lined with the exhaustion of a double shift. "He doesn't have a name yet," she whispered. "The mother walked out of the ER hours after birth and hasn't been seen since. He's waiting for someone who isn't coming back." Have you ever looked at a stranger and known with a chilling certainty that your lives were now tied together with a knot you could never undo? I reached into the bassinet, and the baby's hand curled around my pinky finger with a strength that defied his size. The bird-like weight of him felt more significant than any skyscraper I had ever built. I felt a sudden, fierce, protective instinct surge through me, a heat that pushed back the cold fog of Sarah's death. My lawyers would later warn me about the complexity of the situation, the legal minefields of adopting a child with no history. But I didn't care. I stood at the administrative desk and took the cold hospital pen in my hand. I was signing a birth certificate, but I was also signing my own death warrant. "He's mine now," I told the clerk, my voice firmer than it had been in years. I named him Pierce after my late father, promising him that night that I would never let him feel the chill of being unwanted. I'll protect him from everything, even the truth, I vowed. The nurse mentioned that the biological mother had left a small, distinct silver coin in the bassinet. I tucked it away into my pocket, a tiny secret I never showed Pierce, never realizing that it would one day become a weapon for a woman named Leonie. I walked out of that hospital with a son in my arms, never realizing I had just invited the architect of my own destruction into my heart. I slammed my hand onto the mahogany table, the sound echoing like a gunshot through the executive suite. But the blood-red rage in Pierce's eyes didn't flinch. The wistful memories of the hospital ward evaporated, replaced by the suffocating reality of November 2018. We were in the Morgan Logistics boardroom, a place of glass and steel that I had built for him, yet it felt like a cage for us both. I could smell the expensive leather and the bitterness of stale coffee lingering in the air. Pierce stood at the head of the table presenting a high-risk expansion plan into the crypto-logistics sector with a fervor that bordered on mania. I watched the board members' sharks in tailored suits circling him. I recognized the trap immediately. They wanted this project to fail so they could trigger a clause to strip him of his future voting rights. Brent Rivera, my oldest friend and CFO, sat to my left. What I didn't know then was that Brent had privately encouraged Pierce to present this flawed plan, knowing I would be forced to veto it. "This plan is a suicide mission, Pierce," I said, my voice straining to remain calm. "You're just afraid of the future, Dad." He shot back, his arrogance a shield against the ambush I knew was coming. "How do you tell a man who thinks he's a king that you're only stopping him because you can see the cliff he's about to walk over?" The tension in the room was a physical weight, made worse by the steady hum of the HVAC system. I looked at the digital console in front of me, my finger hovering over the cold, smooth touch of the veto button. To save him from professional execution, I used my majority stake to kill the project right there in front of the people he most wanted to impress. The humiliation was instant. Pierce's face turned a shade of purple I had never seen, and the boy I had tucked into bed looked at me with a hatred that felt cold and alien. "I'm doing this to protect you," I insisted, but he only sneered. "You're doing this to control me." There's a difference. Silence in a skyscraper feels heavier than lead. It presses against your eardrums until you can hear your own heart failing. We retreated to my private office, the setting sun reflecting off the polished mahogany desk in a blinding glare. I tried to reach out, but the bridge was already gone. Pierce delivered the line that would haunt me for the next 6 years. "I'm not really your son, am I? That's why you don't trust me with the keys." He stormed out the door, slamming with a force that left a ringing in my ears. As I stood there shattered, I noticed a folder on my desk I hadn't seen before. It was a private investigator's report on Pierce's biological heritage, one that had clearly been tampered with to feed his resentment. I watched him disappear into the elevator, the doors sliding shut like the lid of a casket, and I knew right then that I hadn't just saved his career, I had lost my son. The Chicago skyline blurred behind the first tears I had shed in a decade, the silence of the room finally breaking me. I sat in the dark of that executive safe house, the expensive silk of my tie feeling like a noose, realizing that I had spent 30 years protecting a secret that was now burning my world to the ground. The memory of the elevator doors sliding shut on Pierce 6 years ago finally snapped, leaving me with nothing but the low hum of the safe house air purifier and the sharp, synthetic smell of the hotel-style furniture. I paced the narrow confines of the room, my reflection in the darkened window showing a man who looked decades older than he had yesterday. I had always told myself that my silence regarding the adoption was for Pierce's benefit, a way to shield him from the cold reality of a cardboard box and a hospital loading dock. But as the pre-dawn light filtered through the blinds, I had to admit the truth. I was protecting my own ego. I wanted to be the architect of a perfect legacy, a father who could curate the truth like a business portfolio. I thought I was saving him from the truth, but I was just saving myself from the consequences of a honesty I feared would break our bond. Now that silence had become the very weapon used to dismantle my life, I began to analyze the blueprint of this betrayal. Pierce's hatred didn't happen overnight. It was a slow poison. I remembered the small signs, the intercepted calls, the sudden coldness at shared charity events, and the silver coin Leonie had apparently used as physical proof of my supposed theft. By not telling Pierce the story myself, I had left a gaping crack in his armor, and a predator had found it. Loyalty is a debt that doesn't expire, but neither does a lie. Is it still a secret if the person you're hiding it from already has the knife to your throat? I suddenly remembered that the silver coin Otis mentioned wasn't just a memento. It was the physical key to a private high-security vault I hadn't opened in years, a small compartment in my office that held the original unredacted police report from 1996. If Leonie had that coin, she had the truth, or at least her twisted version of it. I reached for my coat, determined to find Otis at the headquarters and demand the rest of the story. My hands were halfway into the sleeves when a rhythmic vibration on the glass table made me jump. My smartphone screen was cold and smooth as I swiped it open. It wasn't a call from Otis, but a high-priority security alert from the company's internal system. The message flashed red, a warning that made my heart hammer against my ribs. Unauthorized access detected, Executive Level 40. The shadows in this room aren't hiding monsters. They're hiding memories. I stared at the data feed in disbelief. Someone was accessing the executive restroom vent from the outside, bypassing the primary thermal sensors. The security log indicated that the login used to trigger the biometric override belonged to Otis Henderson. My mind recoiled at the technical impossibility. Otis was a janitor. He shouldn't have even known those sensors existed, let alone possessed the clearance to bypass a level 40 biometric lock. "Otis, what are you doing?" I whispered to the empty room. I stared at the blinking red alert on my screen, knowing that Otis Henderson was either the only man trying to save me or the one finishing what my son had started. I didn't take the elevator this time. I took the service stairs, my lungs burning as I raced to the 40th floor to find the man who held the keys to my execution. The squeak of my car tires in the garage below still echoed in my mind, a frantic reminder that the sanctuary of my office had been breached. I reached the executive level, panting, the hallway eerily quiet in the pre-dawn light. I didn't go to my desk. I went straight to the source of the security alert. I found Otis Henderson in the executive restroom, but he wasn't cleaning. He was standing on a stepladder, a heavy vent cover gripped in his calloused hands. The smell of lemon-scented disinfectant was thick, cloying in the stagnant air. "Explain yourself, Otis." Now I demanded, my voice trembling with a cocktail of adrenaline and suspicion. I wanted to know how he had bypassed the biometric sensors I had paid millions to install. He didn't flinch. He just climbed down his work gloves, looking cold and damp against the polished tile. "I didn't break in, Mr. Morgan. The sensors weren't bypassed because they were already dead." He explained that Brent Rivera, my oldest friend and CFO, had permanently disabled them a week ago under the guise of an emergency maintenance update. The door was left unlocked from the inside for anyone who knew which handle to turn. Otis looked at me, his eyes hollow and weary. A son's love shouldn't have a price tag, but mine was apparently worth exactly $5 million. He told me that 3 days ago, while he was scrubbing the floors in the late hours, he had heard voices drifting through the shared ventilation shaft that connects this room to Pierce's private office. He had climbed the ladder not out of curiosity, but out of a sudden instinctive fear. He heard Pierce speaking to a woman he called Leonie, their voices echoing with a clarity that made my stomach turn. They were detailing the plan to override the brownstone's smart system, calculating the exact moment to trigger the master suite fire, so I would be trapped behind dead-bolted doors. He called her Mom Otis, whispered the metallic clang of the vent cover hitting the floor, puncturing the silence. But he didn't sound like a son. He sounded like a business partner. They laughed about the insurance, sir. $5 million for a tragic electrical failure. I felt the sound of blood rushing in my ears, a deafening roar that made the room tilt. I pressed him on why he hadn't come to me sooner, why he had waited until I was walking to my car. The truth isn't a light. It's a blade that cuts away everything you thought you knew until you're standing naked in the dark. Otis told me he had seen Pierce meeting with Brent Rivera in the shadows of the garage, exchanging a keycard, my spare keycard. He realized the entire hierarchy of the company I built was compromised. "I'm just a janitor," he said, his voice cracking. "Who would have believed me if you were already dead?" He reached into the pocket of his coveralls and produced a small black digital device. He hadn't just overheard the conversation. He had been smart enough to record it. Otis handed me the small black device, his eyes pleading for me to listen. And as I pressed play, I heard my son's voice speak the one word that turned my heart to stone. The voice coming from the tiny speaker didn't belong to the toddler I had taught to ride a bike. It was a rasping, greedy thing that made the skin on my neck crawl. I stood frozen in the executive restroom, the cold tile beneath my feet, feeling like the floor of a tomb. On the recording, Pierce didn't just call Leonie Mom. He called her partner, his tone clinical, as they discussed the split of a $5 million insurance payout. "I want it done tonight, Leonie." My son's voice crackled, distorted and tinny through the cheap plastic device. "He won't even feel the heat. It's not murder if it looks like old wiring." The most painful part wasn't the logistics of my death, but the casual cruelty of his laughter. He joked that I would have wanted a grand exit anyway, a final spectacle for the man who built an empire out of nothing. I felt a cold sweat break out under my starched collar, the moisture making the fabric cling to my spine like a shroud. Otis Henderson watched my face crumble, his own expression, a mask of somber pity, as he witnessed the destruction of the man he served. I leaned against the marble counter, the industrial hum of the building suddenly sounding like a countdown. A numbing devastation washed over me, followed quickly by a visceral disgust that tasted like copper in the back of my throat. I realized then that I couldn't call my own head of security. If Brent Rivera, the man I'd shared 1,000 boardrooms and even more secrets with, was the one who handed over the spare keycard, then the entire internal system was compromised. Have you ever looked at the walls you built and realized they were designed to be your tomb? Every smart lock and high-definition camera in the hallway felt like an eye and an ear belonging to the enemy. I looked at Otis, the only person in this sprawling glass fortress I could still trust. "Go back to your route, Otis," I whispered, my voice sounding like it belonged to someone else. "Don't look at the cameras. Keep that recorder hidden. We are the only two people in this building who aren't compromised." I took the service elevator toward the basement, avoiding the main lobby where my usual security detail waited to greet me with practiced smiles. The industrial hum of the elevator felt like a funeral dirge as I descended. For the first time in 30 years, the company I built felt like a cage. I stepped out onto Wacker Drive, the gray Chicago morning greeting me with a blast of damp pavement and exhaust. My Italian loafers clicked on the wet sidewalk, a lonely sound against the awakening city. The city didn't wake up today. It just stopped pretending to be asleep. I realized that I had built these walls to keep the world out, but now they were only serving to keep me in. I headed for the one place where my status as a CEO didn't mean a thing, the precinct. As I reached the corner, I glanced back at the garage entrance. My heart stopped as I saw Brent Rivera's sleek black car pull into the private ramp an hour earlier than usual. My window of escape had been smaller than I thought, a thin sliver of luck in a world that had suddenly turned predatory. I watched Brent's car disappear into the darkness of the garage, knowing that the man I'd shared 1,000 lunches with was currently planning the menu for my wake. I didn't wait for the desk sergeant to look up. I slapped my corporate ID and the charred report from the fire chief onto the scarred wooden counter, demanding to see someone who handled homicides, not just petty theft. The heavy iron-scented air of the District 18 precinct filled my lungs, a sharp metallic bite that tasted of cold coffee and old radiators. The transition from my cedar-scented office to this buzzing hive of exhaustion was jarring. Phones rang in a cacophony of indifference, and the cold, harsh glare of the overhead fluorescent lights made the morning sun outside feel like a distant memory. I was led past rows of cluttered desks to a cramped cubicle, where I met Detective Christopher Long, a 45-year-old, with eyes like flint and a suit that had seen better days, who didn't look like a man who believed in accidents, especially when billionaires were involved. I sat on a hard plastic chair, my expensive wool coat feeling absurdly out of place. Long leaned back, his professional veneer barely masking a profound weariness. "Mr. Morgan, billionaires usually call their lawyers before the police," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Why are you here?" I leaned forward, my hands finally steadying as I focused on the man before me, because my lawyers didn't pull me out of a burning house. A janitor did. I presented the fire report and Otis's digital recorder, watching for a flicker of disbelief. To my surprise, Long's expression didn't change, but his eyes sharpened. He revealed that he was already looking into Morgan Logistics for suspected money laundering tied to Brent Rivera, making my arrival the final puzzle piece of a larger, uglier picture. He began the rhythmic tapping of his pen on the desk, a sound that seemed to count down the seconds of my old life. "Is it still a coincidence when the lightning that strikes you has your son's fingerprints all over the bolt?" Long reviewed the fire chief's notes regarding the smart system override. "The electrical surge is becoming a favorite for people who don't want to get their hands bloody," he noted. He played the restroom recording, his jaw tightening as Pierce's voice filled the small space. The tinny sound of my son laughing about my grand exit made the metallic taste in my mouth turn to copper. "This recording is gold," Long whispered, "but we need more to link the CFO directly to the murder attempt." He stood up, pacing the small perimeter of his workspace. He warned me that we were now in a race against the conspirators' timeline. If Pierce and Brent realize I survived, they will either vanish or try again, perhaps with less subtle methods. "From this moment on, you don't exist to your company," he said, the muffled sound of a distant siren punctuating his words. "You're a ghost, until I say otherwise." "I've spent 30 years being the most visible man in Chicago," I replied with a grim smile. "I think I can handle being a ghost." In this precinct, my wealth wasn't a shield. It was a target. Long reached into a drawer and pulled out a grainy surveillance photo from a week ago. He showed me Brent Rivera meeting with an unidentified woman in a parking lot. Long tapped the photo of the woman next to Brent and leaned in, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous rumble. "If this is the woman Pierce calls Mom, then we aren't just looking at arson. We're looking at a professional hit." My smartphone vibrated against the cold steel of the interrogation table, the screen illuminating the dim room with a name that felt like a splash of acid Pierce. I stared at the sharp, artificial blue light, the sharp hum of the phone echoing like a drum in the stagnant air of the precinct. Detective Long leaned in, his eyes narrowed with predatory stillness, watching the screen as if it were a bomb about to detonate. The text notification popped up, a masterpiece of feigned concern that made my stomach turn. Pierce wrote about how he had just seen the news and heard about the electrical surge at the brownstone, asking if I was safe. A wave of nausea washed over me. The boy I raised was checking his work. He mentioned an electrical surge, a detail the fire chief and the police had kept strictly under wraps to avoid tipping off an arsonist. It was the slip of a man who knew exactly what the fire investigators would find, because he had designed the failure himself. "He's checking his work, isn't he?" I whispered, my voice sounding thin and foreign to my own ears. Long didn't move a muscle. "Don't touch it yet," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "Let him sweat for 3 more minutes. We need him to think you're in shock, not that you're waiting by the phone." I sat there in the silence, broken only by the distant hum of a computer fan and the smell of ozone and industrial cleaner that seemed to cling to everything in this building. How do you find the right words to tell a lie to the person who knows your voice better than anyone else on earth? Every second felt like a year as I stared at that glowing screen, realizing that at the exact moment Pierce hit send, he likely believed I was nothing more than a charred corpse in the wreckage of my home. The cognitive dissonance was a physical weight, a pressure behind my ribs that made it hard to breathe. Long eventually nodded, sliding the phone closer to me. "Write that you're at a hotel. Tell him you lost everything." He coached, his clinical focus acting as a bridge across my internal fragmentation. "I'm typing my own obituary while I'm still breathing." I replied, my fingers trembling as I began to navigate the keyboard. I crafted the response with the care of a tactical strike. "I'm safe, Pierce. The house is gone. I don't know what to do. I'm at the Drake. I need a few hours. To survive my son." I was becoming a stranger to the truth, weaving a digital performance for the one person I used to protect from every shadow. The send button felt like a trigger, and I was the one standing in the crosshairs. As the message vanished into the cellular ether, Long revealed that his cyber unit had already cloned my phone. Every reply Pierce sent would now be a beacon, a tracked data point for the investigators. Within seconds, the 3 small, typing bubbles appeared on the screen, dancing like a frantic heartbeat. "He's coming for the inheritance, isn't he?" I asked, looking at the detective. Long shook his head slowly. "He's coming for the finish, Carl. We just gave him the map." The bubbles on the screen continued their jittery dance, and for a split second, I wondered if Pierce could hear my own heart pounding through the digital signal, sensing the ghost I had become. The steady rhythmic ticking of a clock on the precinct wall filled the silence as minutes felt like hours. I sat in that dim interview room, the ghost of my son's digital presence still vibrating in the air. How much is a father's life worth when the man holding the ledger is drowning in his own mistakes? Detective Long didn't wait for my answer. He began diving into the financial rot of Pierce Morgan's bank accounts, the dry rustle of bank statements sounding like a slow-motion collapse. He pulled up a series of red-flagged transactions on the glowing clinical blue of his computer monitor. The bank records showed that some of the gambling debts were co-signed by an unknown business associate, suggesting Pierce wasn't just alone in his addiction. He was being enabled by someone close to the company. My heart sank as the scrolling lines of code and currency revealed a double life I had completely missed. Pierce had been bleeding his trust fund dry for 3 years to fuel a spiraling high-stakes gambling addiction. The numbers were staggering, showing a consistent hemorrhage of cash to offshore sportsbooks and local underground card games. He didn't just spend the money. Carl Long said, his voice cutting through the heavy, weighted silence. He gambled away the foundation of his entire life. $750,000. That's not a debt. That's a death sentence. Money is the root of all evil, but debt is the fertilizer that makes it grow. I felt a crushing disappointment, a physical weight in my chest, as I realized my son had been underwater for a long time. Long then highlighted a specific wire transfer made 3 weeks ago, $50,000. Sent to a man named Silas Ward. My breath hitched in my throat as I recognized the name. Silas Ward. I saved that man's career 12 years ago when he was accused of theft. I whispered, the smell of stale coffee and ink in the precinct suddenly feeling suffocating. Long looked at me with those flint-like eyes. "He wasn't buying a career this time, Carl. He was buying a hitman. The timing of this payment perfectly aligned with the purchase of the specialized equipment used to bypass my smart home security system. The sense of double betrayal was a cold sensation that spread from my stomach to my limbs. The bank statements read like an autopsy report for my son's integrity. I looked at the paperwork for my own $5 million life insurance policy, now sitting on Long's desk as evidence. I had wanted him to have everything to be secure if I ever passed. Greed doesn't want everything eventually. Long reminded me softly. It wants it now. I stared at my own signature on that document, feeling as though I'd written my own death warrant decades ago. Then a final detail appeared on the screen that made my blood turn to ice. Silas Ward had been recently rehired by Pierce at a subsidiary company, just 2 months before the fire, placing the hitman directly on the company payroll under my own nose. I looked at Silas Ward's address on the screen and realized that the man I'd helped stay out of prison was currently the only one who could tell me where my son was hiding. Gratitude is supposed to be a lifetime bond, a shield against the darker impulses of the soul, but looking at Silas Ward's name, I realized that for $50,000, even a saved soul has an expiration date. I stared at the clinical light of the precinct monitor, my mind slipping back into the yellowed edges of 2012. Silas Ward, 35, appeared in the old warehouse photo with a hollowed-out look of desperation that I had once mistaken for simple gratitude. I remembered the smell of damp cardboard in the warehouse memory, a cold, sterile office where I had found him trembling. He had been a low-level manager back then, framed for a massive embezzlement charge. I had spent a week personally digging through the ledgers until I produced the evidence of the real culprit. I won't let an innocent man rot for a bookkeeper's greed, Silas, I had told him, as he wept with relief. I owe you my life, Mr. Morgan, he had whispered. I'll never forget this. I had even written a glowing recommendation letter that secured him a second chance at a logistics firm. Now looking at the screen, a nauseating clarity hit me. I recalled that the firm where I sent that letter was actually owned by Brent Rivera's brother. I had unwittingly built a hidden bridge between my CFO and a man who felt he owed me a life debt he was now paying back in blood. I looked at Detective Long, the rhythmic clicking of his keyboard, the only sound in the heavy silence. Pierce knew Silas. I explained, my chest tightening. They used to play catch in the company parking lot when Pierce was a teenager. Pierce didn't just hire a professional. He weaponized a man he once called Uncle Silas. He turned an old act of mercy into a surgical instrument for my murder. If the man who owes you everything is the one holding the match, what hope is there for the rest of the world? Long leaned in his face, grim. It was a calculated move, Carl. Hiring Silas was a psychological insurance policy. If he succeeded, Pierce was rich. If he failed, the connection to your own history would muddy the water for any investigator. Long pointed to a digital map on his screen where a red dot was pulsing near my office building. We need to find him before he decides to finish the job for free to cover his tracks, Long muttered. I gave him a second chance, I whispered, feeling an internal shattering that no company merger could fix. I never thought he'd use it to take mine. Mercy is a currency that some people only spend once, and Silas had clearly moved on to a more profitable tender. Long's eyes suddenly widened as a new data packet flashed on his screen. He discovered that Silas Ward's phone had just pinged near the service entrance of the Morgan Logistics headquarters. He isn't running. Carl Long said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous frequency. He's following the janitor. He knows Otis is the only witness who can place him at the scene. The map on Long's screen blinked with a new red dot, and as I saw it move toward the north side, I realized that Silas Ward wasn't just hiding, he was hunting. And Otis Henderson was the prey. There is a specific kind of silence that follows the death of a 20-year friendship, a vacuum that sucks the air right out of your lungs before the grief even has a chance to settle. I sat in Detective Long's office, the weight of the wool coat on my shoulders, feeling like lead as I watched him lean over his desk. The clinical hum of the detective's computer was the only sound in the room, save for the rhythmic ticking of a clock that seemed to be measuring the final moments of my sanity. Long turned his monitor toward me, displaying a complex, glowing map of network pings and IP logs. The bright, jagged lines of the network map on the screen looked like a nervous system under stress. The remote override of my home security wasn't done by a sophisticated hacker from the outside, Long said, his voice dropping to a somber low. It was specifically executed using high-level administrative credentials from a terminal inside Morgan Logistics. The forensic audit showed that the security override didn't just turn off the cameras, it specifically reprogrammed the smart locks to trap me inside my bedroom, turning my luxury home into a furnace. This wasn't a brute force attack, Carl. Someone used a master key. Analytical dread began to pool in my stomach as I stared at the data. Long highlighted the specific terminal ID used for the breach terminal CFO-01. My vision blurred. That was the private encrypted computer in Brent Rivera's office. I looked at the logs showing the terminal was active at 11:15 p.m. on the night of the fire, the exact moment my sanctuary became a tomb. Brent. "No, that's impossible," I whispered, smelling the faint metallic scent of cold, stale coffee. "We've been partners for 2 decades. "The logs don't lie," Carl Long replied. "He was in his office while you were supposed to be burning. If you can't trust the man who knows your passwords, who on this earth can you trust with your life?" The rejection of the truth was visceral, a physical nausea that made the room tilt. I leaned back, my mind racing through thousands of hours spent with Brent. Weddings, we celebrated funerals, where we leaned on each other the very day Pierce was born. The man I called brother was the one who handed my son the gasoline. I had given him everything. I even gave him a seat at my own table. I muttered the words, tasting like copper. Long looked at me with a grim sympathy. He didn't want a seat, Carl. He wanted the table. Absolute devastation began to solidify into a cold, emerging rage. Loyalty is a shadow. It's only there when the sun is shining, and Brent had clearly decided my sun had set. But the final blow was yet to come. The forensic audit revealed that Brent had been funneling small, untraceable amounts of company capital into Pierce's gambling accounts for over a year, long before the hit was ever planned. He hadn't just joined the conspiracy. He had cultivated the desperation that made it possible. Long slid another document across the desk, the paper making a dry, rasping sound against the wood. "Brent Rivera owes $200,000 to the same loan shark syndicate that has your son by the throat." Long said, his finger tapping the highlighted figure. "He promised Pierce that once you were gone, they'd use your life insurance to clear both their debts and split the remainder." It was never about the company, Carl. It was about survival. 2 men drowning, and you were the life raft they decided to sink. I looked at the glowing green cursor on the screen and realized that Brent Rivera hadn't just betrayed me. He had spent years grooming my son to be the weapon that finished me. The reflection of my face in the polished glass of the Morgan Logistics elevator was that of a stranger, a man carved from ice and shadow. I smoothed the front of my suit, feeling the concealed digital recorder Long had given me press against my ribs like a cold, accusing finger. Every floor the elevator ascended felt like a deeper descent into a world that had been hollowed out from within. When the doors slid open to the lobby, the air felt thin, stripped of the filtered cedar scent I used to find comforting. I walked through the glass and steel lobby, receiving sympathetic looks from employees who moved like ghosts in the morning light. They offered soft, practiced condolences, thinking I had lost everything to an accidental surge of electricity. "Good morning, Mr. Morgan," a receptionist whispered, her eyes shiny with pity. "We're so sorry about your home." "Thank you," I replied, my voice a steady, hollow chime. "Brick and mortar can be replaced. People can't." I maintained the mask of a shaken survivor, but internally I was a predator measuring the distance to the throat. Brent Rivera was already in the boardroom, wearing the gold watch I had given him for our 10th anniversary. The sun caught the metal, making it look like a trophy of his betrayal. He lunged toward me with a staged, effusive greeting, his voice booming with a counterfeit relief that made my skin crawl. "Thank God you're safe." "We were worried sick," he said, gripping my hand. I watched his pupils dilate as he looked into my eyes, searching for a spark of suspicion. "I'm a hard man to get rid of, Brent. You know that better than anyone." Watching him was like looking at a fractured mirror. The more he tried to hold the pieces together, the more the jagged edges showed. He sat down, the squeak of his expensive leather chair sounding like a confession. Despite the aggressive air conditioning, a fine sheen of sweat had formed on his upper lip. We began the morning briefing, the Chicago skyline, reflecting off the polished mahogany table, like a deceptive promise of stability. I listened to the quarterly logistics reports, my mind elsewhere, feeling the rhythmic vibration of the office around me. He wasn't sweating because of the heat. He was sweating because of the ghost sitting across from him. I deliberately steered the conversation toward the police investigation, mentioning that the fire department had found a remote bypass. I saw his hand tremble as he reached for his coffee cup, the liquid rippling against the porcelain. The bypass came from a local terminal, I noted, watching him with surgical precision. Is that so? Brent stammered, his eyes darting to the financial dashboard on the wall. Technology. It's a double-edged sword, isn't it? He looked away, but not before I noticed a smear of blue ink on his notes where his hand had shook. My gaze drifted to the digital screen behind him, and I felt a fresh surge of cold fury. There was a subtle, unauthorized change in the liquidity projections. Brent was already shifting capital in anticipation of a death that hadn't happened yet. He was liquidating the empire while the body was still warm. As the meeting ended, Brent avoided my eyes, but I saw his reflection in the polished mahogany. He was already reaching for his phone before I'd even left the room. The man I called my brother hadn't just handed my son the matches. He was drowning in the same gasoline, and they were both praying I'd be the one to spark the flame. I retreated into my private office, the cold metallic click of the door lock sounding like a finality I wasn't ready to accept. I ignored the muffled sound of office gossip through the heavy oak door and sat at my dark mahogany desk. The smell of high-end furniture polish and a splash of expensive bourbon from a crystal decanter filling the air. My laptop sat waiting, its blue glare casting long, sharp shadows across my face. I opened the encrypted file Detective Long had sent, the dry, parchment-like sound of digital pages turning in my mind. The data dump was a graveyard of bad decisions. Brent Rivera's personal finances were hemorrhaging. He had a $250,000 deficit to a private betting ring in Atlantic City. The file revealed a deeper rot. Brent was actually the one who had leaked Pierce's adoption records to Leonie years ago, initiating this entire collapse. 200,000 in red ink, I whispered to the empty room. Brent, what did you do? He didn't just need the money. He needed me to disappear to cover the years of siphoning he'd used to stay afloat. When does a best friend stop being a brother and start being a scavenger? I felt a cold, analytical horror as I dug further. The intercepted communications between Brent and Pierce showed they weren't plotting out of a shared love for a woman or a cause. It was a desperate, mutual union of financial ruin. Brent had promised to facilitate the insurance claim and a swift corporate takeover in exchange for a massive consulting fee from the payout. My life insurance was the only currency they had left to pay off a combined $1 million gambling debt. They weren't fighting for a legacy or the Morgan name. They were fighting for a way out of the holes they had dug for themselves. The realization of the calculation of cruelty made my hands shake. Brent had spent 10 years rotting my son's heart, acting as the cool uncle who understood his frustrations while secretly fueling the fire. It wasn't a betrayal. It was a harvest. I realized that the entire family structure I had cherished was a carefully constructed lie maintained by the man I trusted most. My son was merely the weapon Brent had spent a decade sharpening. The empire I built wasn't made of stone. It was made of dry tinder, and they were just waiting for the match. I felt a heart-wrenching resolution settle over me as I scrolled to the final email in the thread. Brent had already requested an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning to declare me mentally unfit due to the trauma of the fire. He was moving for the kill, intending to strip me of my power before I could even find my footing. I looked at the clock on my wall, the one Brent had given me on my 50th birthday, and realized the police had just located the hitman's hideout. The predator was finally being cornered, but the wound in my chest was wider than I ever imagined. Before Silas Ward was a ghost in my rearview mirror, or a name on a police ledger, he was a man I'd pulled back from the edge of a jagged cliff. Staring at the clock on my wall, the one Brent had given me on my 50th birthday, my mind retreated 12 years into the past, back to the humid August of 2012. I found myself standing in the Morgan Logistics warehouse, the air thick with the smell of diesel fuel and morning fog. A young Silas Ward stood trembling in the foreman's office, his face a mask of absolute terror. He had been accused of embezzling $40,000 from the shipping accounts. The evidence presented by Greg, the warehouse manager, looked airtight, a series of damning digital pings that pointed straight to Silas's terminal. "I didn't take a dime, mister," Morgan Silas had whispered, his voice cracking with desperation. "I swear it on my mother's name. The numbers don't lie, Silas." I replied, my voice calm but heavy with the weight of the moment. But sometimes people make the numbers say what they want. What I didn't realize until now was that Greg was a distant cousin of Brent Rivera. The rot in my empire had begun long before I noticed the stench. I halted the arrest, ignoring Greg's demands for a police escort, and locked myself in the main office for a midnight audit. The rhythmic hum of a vintage industrial fan was the only thing that kept me company as I worked under the cold, harsh glare of a single desk lamp. Silence is the loudest sound in an empty warehouse, especially when you are hunting for a thief. I spent the night fueled by lukewarm coffee, sifting through the layers of encrypted data. Around 3 in the morning, I found it. It was a sophisticated series of double entries that required a level of clearance Silas didn't possess. Greg had been sloppy, leaving a digital fingerprint that revealed a systematic frame-up designed to cover his own gambling-related deficit. Have you ever wondered if the hand you reach out to save someone is the same one that will eventually hand them the knife? As dawn broke over the shipping yard, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gray, I called Silas back in. The weight of a heavy brass paperweight on my desk felt significant as I pushed the cleared audit toward him. "You're not going to jail, Silas," I said, the scratch of my ballpoint pen on a commendation letter sounding like a pardon. "You're going to work." I promoted him to the security division that morning, unaware that I was giving him the very clearance codes he would eventually use to bypass my home's defenses. "I owe you my life, sir," he told me, his eyes wet with profound relief. "If you ever need me for anything at all, just ask." Integrity isn't just about doing the right thing. It's about surviving the fallout. I watched him leave, feeling the pride of a man who had saved a soul. I looked at Silas's letter of recommendation sitting in the police file and realized that by saving his future 12 years ago, I had inadvertently provided the blueprints for my own murder. The rhythmic thrum of rain against glass was the only thing grounding me as I stood behind the one-way mirror. The metal chair screeched against the linoleum as Silas Ward collapsed into it, his face the color of damp ash and his eyes refusing to meet mine through the one-way glass. I stood in the dark observation room, the smell of damp wool and precinct floor wax clinging to my senses, while my own hands vibrated against the cold metal observation rail. Detective Long entered the room with a clinical stride and placed the $50,000 wire transfer receipt on the table. Silas didn't even try to lie. He began to sob immediately, a sound of pure, exhausted terror that filled the small space. He revealed that Pierce hadn't just blackmailed him. He had threatened to hurt Silas's young daughter, presenting fabricated evidence that would send Silas back to prison for 20 years if he refused the contract. He said he'd make me a ghost if I didn't help him make you one. Silas gasped, his red, swollen eyes fixed on the tabletop. "I didn't want the money, detective. I wanted my life back. I wanted to keep my little girl safe from the monster your son has become." I watched as the cold, metallic click of handcuffs being removed punctuated his words, a small mercy from Long. Silas wiped his face, his voice trembling as he explained the tactical sabotage of the fire. He had disabled the security, yes, but he had purposely bypassed the primary gas line override. He used a low-temperature accelerant for the electrical surge, knowing it would produce a massive amount of smoke for 10 minutes before the flames ever reached my master suite. "Is it possible for a man to be both your executioner and your guardian angel at the exact same time?" I rigged it. "To fail," Sir Silas cried, looking toward the glass as if he could see my soul through the mirror. It was a theater of death, not a hit. I couldn't kill the man who gave me my name back in 2012. I needed it to look real enough to keep my daughter safe, but I needed you to wake up. His words were a confession, but they felt like a lifeline being thrown into my own private ocean of grief. Silas revealed a further layer of the plan. He was the one who left the executive restroom door unlocked for Otis. He knew the janitor was a man of habit and integrity, someone who would overhear the final coordination call and act as my shield. He was too afraid of his own parole to go to the police, so he weaponized the only honest man in the building to save me. "Mr. Morgan, I'm sorry," he whispered, sensing my presence. "I was trapped between two fathers, and I tried to save us both." But the final revelation was a cold needle to the heart. Silas admitted that the actual electrical surge was triggered by a device Brent Rivera had installed weeks earlier. The CFO wasn't just a bystander. He was the primary technical architect. I turned away from the glass, my heart hammering against my ribs, and looked at Long. "If Silas rigged the fire to fail," I whispered, "then who was the one who called my burner phone right before the explosion?" The flickering, fluorescent light of the precinct hallway cast jittery shadows against the linoleum as I walked back toward Long's desk, my mind reeling from Silas's confession. Is it possible for a seed of kindness planted 5 years ago in a desperate break room to grow into the very wall that stops a hitman's bullet? I saw Otis Henderson sitting on a wooden bench in the lobby, his posture slumped and his work-worn hands clasped tightly. The sight of him triggered a vivid memory from the spring of 2019. I had found Otis weeping in the company break room, after hours the clinical white of the room feeling cold and unforgiving. His son had been diagnosed with aggressive leukemia, and the mounting medical bills were about to cost them their home. "My son is dying because I can't afford a doctor, Mr. Morgan," he had sobbed, his voice sounding utterly broken. "Not on my watch. Otis," I told him, writing a check that covered the entire treatment and secured the best specialists in Chicago. "Consider the bills settled. Just keep it between us." Back in the present, Otis looked up as I approached the blue light of the burner phone reflecting in my eyes. He admitted he was the mystery caller. Otis revealed that his son, now healthy, actually works in the Morgan Logistics IT department and was the one who secretly flagged the biometric override for his father, allowing Otis to dig deeper into the executive levels. "I had to be sure you heard me," Sir Otis whispered, his rough fingers trembling with a mixture of fatigue and adrenaline. "I risked everything to find that emergency number in the company directory. I owed you my son's life, and I wasn't going to let them take yours while I still had breath in my body. In the end, it wasn't my security team that saved me. It was a check I forgot I ever wrote. Kindness isn't a business transaction." "Otis," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "but it seems you've paid me back with interest." I realized the symmetry of my survival. Silas sabotaged the fire because I saved his career, and Otis provided the final warning because I saved his family. I looked at these two men and realized they were more my family than the son currently plotting my death. I built an empire out of steel and glass, but it was a few pieces of paper and a little mercy that actually kept me alive. Loyalty is a boomerang. You throw it out into the world and hope it doesn't hit you in the back when it returns. Detective Long looked up from his terminal, the rhythmic tapping of raindrops against the precinct windows providing a somber backbeat to his announcement. He discovered that the burner phone call was actually recorded by the service provider, capturing the exact moment the fire was remotely ignited by Brent's terminal. "We have enough now," Carl Long said, his eyes hard and full of professional resolve. "Let's bring them down." I looked at the digital recording. Long was holding the final piece of the puzzle, and knew that by tomorrow morning, the woman Pierce called Mom would finally show her true face. The truth was coming for Leonie Gonzalez, and I was going to be the one to hand it to her. I thought I knew what a monster looked like, but as Long slid the first black and white mugshot across the table, I realized I'd been looking for a beast when I should have been looking for a ghost with a charming smile. The precinct records room was dim, smelling of old paper and dust that had settled over decades of human failure. Leonie Gonzalez, 52, looked out from the mugshot with high cheekbones and eyes that were cold, empty voids where a soul should have been. Long revealed that she had used over 12 aliases in 20 years, and her real name, the one on Pierce's original abandoned birth record, was actually Leonie Rivera. The name hit me like a physical blow. She isn't just a woman who fell on hard times, Carl Long said, his voice flat as he pointed to her comprehensive criminal history. She's a professional grifter with a trail of miraculous reunions across 3 states. She doesn't have a maternal instinct. She has a business model. She waited 30 years for your trust fund to mature. Disgust and mounting horror pooled in my stomach as Long explained how she uses ancestry websites to track down children she abandoned, specifically targeting those adopted into wealth. How do you compete with a lie that promises a son the one thing he thinks he's missing? A reason to hate the man who loved him. I viewed the archived messages she had sent to Pierce. They were masterclasses in psychological warfare, alternating between weeping apologies for giving him up and venomous lies claiming I had stolen him through a corrupt legal system. Your father didn't save you, Pierce. He bought you one message, read the grainy, pixelated screenshot burning into my retinas. He's keeping your inheritance in a cage. Don't you want to be free? I watched the digital progression of my son's descent from skepticism to murderous rage as she isolated him from me. The ticking of an old analog clock on the wall seemed to count the beats of my breaking heart. Long then revealed the most chilling detail. Leonie had successfully extorted a family in Ohio 5 years ago, using the exact same playbook. But the target died of a heart attack before testimony could be given. She's a harvester, Carl. She plants the seeds of doubt and waits for the insurance to bloom. She didn't just find my son. I whispered, the bitter taste of lukewarm coffee lingering on my tongue. She manufactured a killer. She wasn't a mother. She was an infection. My eyes scanned the final pages of the dossier, and my breath hitched. I discovered a hidden transaction. Leonie didn't just stumble upon Pierce. She had been hired by Brent Rivera to initiate the contact. My best friend hadn't just stood by. He was the one who reached into the past and pulled this devil into our lives. I looked at the grainy photo of Leonie and Brent together at a roadside diner and realized that my best friend hadn't just betrayed me. He had sold my son's soul to a devil he'd known since childhood. The betrayal wasn't a sudden spark. It was a long, cold burn orchestrated by the people I trusted most in this world. The realization didn't hit me with a bang. It was the soft, nauseating click of a puzzle piece sliding into place, revealing that my son hadn't just lost his way. He had been led by the hand into a slaughterhouse. I stood in the records room, the heavy silence punctuated only by the rhythmic hum of the precinct's ventilation system. Long slid a new stack of deeper communication logs toward me, and I felt a physical ache in my chest as I began to read. Every time Pierce showed a moment of hesitation or guilt in his messages to Leonie, Brent would swoop in with a supportive call to Morgan Logistics. He wasn't just observing from the sidelines. He was actively managing my son's emotional instability. Brent knew every trigger and every insecurity Pierce had. He gave her the manual for his destruction. It was a cold, clinical architecture of grooming. He didn't just sell him out, Carl Long muttered, his voice sounding distant through the fog in my mind. He hollowed him out. I saw a recorded voicemail from Brent to Leonie, where my oldest friend laughed about how easy it was to convince Pierce that I was planning to disinherit him. How do you fight an enemy that has been living inside your son's head, whispering your name like a curse for 6 years? The rage I had carried since the fire began to transform into a devastating, heavy pity. I realized that Pierce's 6-year silence was likely enforced by Brent's narrative, a story where I was the villain and they were his only allies. I looked at transcripts of Uncle Brent telling Pierce that I spoke of him with disdain after the 2018 veto. He's 30 years old, I whispered, staring at the blurred neon city lights through the grimy window. But in their hands, he was just that abandoned baby in the box again. I was looking for a criminal, but I found a casualty. Pierce wasn't the monster under my bed. He was the child I'd left alone in the dark. Long revealed that the silver coin Leonie used to prove her identity was actually a fake. My own jeweler had flagged years ago, proving she had been planning this heist for a decade. Long asked if I still wanted to proceed with the sting operation, given the complexity of the manipulation. I hardened my gaze, my voice cracking but remaining steady. "He has to fall to be saved." I said the words tasting like iron. "If we don't take him down now, Brent and Leonie will eventually discard him, just like they tried to discard me. Once the money is clear, they'll be the ones to finish him off. To save my son's soul, I have to be the one to catch him in the act of trying to take my life." It was a choice born of a desperate, sacrificial love. I closed the file, my knuckles white against the dry, papery transcripts. The metallic click of the record room's deadbolt sounded like a starting gun. "Set the trap," I whispered, looking directly at Long. "But when the cage closes, I want to be the first thing he sees." I needed him to know that even in the face of his worst mistake, I was still the one who wouldn't walk away from him. I watched the adhesive tape snap against Silas Ward's skin, a surgical preparation for a performance where a single missed line would mean my permanent retirement and his return to a cage. We were in a dimly lit tactical staging room at District 18, a space that smelled of rubbing alcohol and the heavy metallic tang of industrial-grade anxiety. Silas was visibly trembling, his eyes darting toward the silent officers who were methodically checking their gear. Long leaned over him, his face a mask of professional intensity, as he secured the microphone to Silas's chest. "If he senses the wire, Silas, he won't hesitate," Long warned. "You know that better than anyone in this building." "I'm doing this for Mr. Morgan, Silas," whispered his voice cracking. "Just get my daughter to safety. That's the only deal I care about." I stood in the corner, my own breath coming in shallow hitches, realizing the man I had once saved from a prison cell was now the only barrier between me and a lethal legacy. Long checked the high-resolution button camera, disguised as a frayed thread on Silas's coat. "This will give me a first-person view of my son's face when the truth finally comes out, a perspective I never thought I would have to endure." We moved to the surveillance van, a cramped, windowless box that smelled of ozone and hot electronics. I sat on a low bench surrounded by glowing monitors that cast an eerie blue light across Long's face. "Check 1, 2. "Can you hear my heart?" Silas's voice came through the speakers, tinny and scratchy, accompanied by the rhythmic, heavy thump of his pulse. Loud and clear, Silas Long replied, his fingers dancing across a keyboard. "Keep your breathing steady." How many fathers have sat in a windowless van praying for the recording of their son's voice to be the evidence that sends them to prison? The irony was a physical weight, a coldness in my chest that no heater could touch. Before I reveal the conversation that changed the course of my life, if you are still with me, comment A. If you think I should forgive him, or B, if he deserves the full weight of the law, and add one short reason why. A quick note, the next part includes some fictionalized details added to deepen the emotional impact and convey the core message. If you prefer strictly factual retellings, you are free to stop here. The van pulled into a narrow, oil-slicked alleyway across from the Morgan Logistics garage. I watched the digital clock on the dashboard, each glowing segment counting down the seconds to 9 p.m. The orange glow of streetlights reflected off the wet pavement outside, making the city look like it was bleeding. Silas stepped out of the secondary police vehicle 3 blocks away, a lonely, hunched figure in a heavy coat. Watching him walk toward the mouth of that garage made the metallic taste of recycled air turn bitter in my mouth. "He's in position," Long muttered, his eyes glued to the screen. "Everyone stay quiet. This is it. The end of the lie." The garage wasn't just a meeting spot. It was an altar, and I was the sacrifice that refused to stay dead. The monitor flickered to life, showing the grainy fisheye perspective of the garage entrance. As a pair of headlights swept across the concrete, A nondescript silver SUV pulled in parking directly behind Silas. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized Brent had sent his own eyes to watch the kill. The sharp, metallic click of a car door locking signaled the start of a nightmare I had prayed was a hallucination. The heels of Pierce's designer shoes clicked against the oil-stained concrete, a sharp, rhythmic sound that cut through the low hum of the surveillance van's monitors like a ticking clock. I sat paralyzed in the dark interior of the van, feeling the cold bite of the garage air through the ventilation. On the monitor, the grainy, distorted green tint of the night vision feed flickered, showing Silas standing as still as a tombstone. Pierce stepped into the frame, his face partially obscured by the heavy collar of an expensive overcoat, while the silver SUV remained idling in the background, its high beams creating long, distorted shadows that danced against the damp concrete walls. Pierce stopped 5 feet from Silas, his posture radiating a rigid, entitled arrogance that made my stomach turn. "You're late, Silas?" He snapped, his voice crisp and devoid of any human warmth. "I don't pay for tardiness." "Traffic was heavy," Silas replied, his voice a masterpiece of forced calm. "I had to be sure I wasn't followed." I watched through the hidden camera as my son leaned in, his eyes darting around the shadows. He wasn't talking about his father. He was talking about an obstacle in a quarterly report. The audio clarified as he lowered his voice. "He survived," Pierce hissed. "You told me the master suite would be a kiln. Why is he still breathing?" "The fire department was too fast," Silas countered. "The old man has more luck than sense. He's in hiding now." I listened, my heart hammering against my ribs, as my son used cold corporate terminology to discuss the failed liquidation of my life. He didn't ask if I was burned. He didn't ask if I was terrified. He simply revealed that he had already signed over my power of attorney to Brent Rivera. "In the eyes of the law and the company, Carl, you are already a ghost," Detective Long whispered beside me. Pierce snarled at Silas, the sound of water dripping from an overhead pipe punctuating his rage. "The partnership with Brent and Leonie depends on a death certificate being issued by the end of the week. I don't care how you do it. Poison a staged mugging, another accident. Just make sure he stops breathing. Doubled bonus for a closed casket result." "He's still your father," Pierce Silas said, a final test of a soul that had clearly already departed. "How do you recognize the monster you created when it's wearing your own eyes and speaking with your own inflection?" My son didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small vial, the glass catching a glint of the garage lights. "Leonie provided this," he said. "A backup plan. It's a toxin that mimics a massive heart attack. No smoke, no sirens, just a quiet end to a long overdue transition." He handed the vial to Silas, his composure returning as he finalized the transaction of my murder. Pierce leaned in until his face filled the hidden camera, his eyes devoid of anything but greed. The reflection of the high beams in his pupils made him look like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. "He's still breathing." "Silas," he hissed, the sound echoing through the van's speakers like a death sentence. "Fix it." I closed my eyes as the visual feed stayed locked on my son's merciless smile. The burst of static in the van was the final gavel drop before the world descended into madness. The silence of the garage didn't just break. It exploded into a symphony of screeching tires, blinding strobe lights, and the guttural roars of men who were finished waiting for the devil to reveal himself. I watched the monitors with a nauseating detachment as tactical units swarmed the garage from hidden entry points I had walked past 1,000 times. Pierce tried to flee toward his sedan, but he was intercepted by a blacked-out SUV that rammed his car door shut with the force of a thunderclap. In the grainy feed, I saw my son wrestled to the oil-stained concrete, his expensive designer overcoat tearing against the grit as the plastic zip ties bit into his wrists. "Police don't move. Get on the ground!" the speakers screamed. Yet Pierce's voice rose in a high, panicked trill. "Wait. You don't understand. I'm Pierce Morgan. It was a pathetic refrain, the sound of a man trying to use a name he had just attempted to erase. The acrid smell of burnt rubber from the SUV's tires seemed to seep through the van's vents. As the tactical team secured the perimeter, they discovered a secondary remote start incendiary device rigged to Pierce's own fuel tank. Leonie hadn't just intended for me to die. She had planned to eliminate Pierce as well once I was confirmed dead. Simultaneously, miles away at headquarters, a secondary team breached the executive suite. They found Brent Rivera standing over a high-capacity industrial shredder, a stack of offshore account ledgers clutched in his trembling hands. The shredder's whine was the scream of a dying friendship. The mechanical groan filled the room as he tried to feed the evidence of his betrayal into the blades. But the police tackled him before the most incriminating documents could be destroyed. "The warrant has your name on it, Brent?" A voice crackled over the radio. Along with the word conspiracy, I sat in the darkness feeling the weight of the double betrayal like a physical blow to my sternum. Detective Long confirmed via radio that both primary targets were in custody. I stepped out of the van into the cold night air, my lungs finally expanding after hours of shallow, constricted breathing. The cold, sharp bite of the November wind on my face felt like a mercy. I watched as the silver SUV from earlier was searched only to find it empty. Leonie Rivera was nowhere near the kill zone. She had been directing the hit from a burner phone in a different zip code, leaving her pawns to take the fall for a game she had mastered decades ago. "We got them," Carl Long said, stepping beside me. "It's over." I looked at the dark skyline, feeling a hollow ache that no legal victory could fill. "It's not over," I replied softly. "It's just stationary. How many times can one heart break before it simply turns to ash?" I saw the rhythmic, blinding strobe of blue and red police lights reflecting off the glass of my building. Among the debris in Brent's office, the police found a half-destroyed letter addressed to Leonie detailing a plan to skip the country, together with the insurance money once the smoke cleared. I watched the flashing blue lights dance across the glass of my building and realized that while the criminals were in chains, the ghosts of our past were now the only ones left in charge. The glass doors of the precinct hissed shut behind me, sealing out the Chicago night, but trapping me in a fluorescent cage filled with the ghosts of the men I used to trust. I followed the transport vans through the heavy rain, the squeal of their tires still echoing in my mind like a dying scream. Inside the atmosphere was a buzzing hive of industrial cleaner and cheap coffee, a scent that clung to the cold, abrasive texture of the precinct walls. I walked through the booking area, and my breath caught as I saw Brent Rivera being processed. He was stripped of his custom-tailored suit jacket, and his dignity standing there in a wrinkled shirt that looked as defeated as he did. When he saw me, he began to shout, his voice a frantic rasp that bounced off the harsh, unforgiving hum of the fluorescent lights. "Carl, look at me. I did it for the company. Pierce was going to ruin us with his debts. I had to protect our legacy." He even claimed he had been recording his conversations with Pierce for months, planning to use them as blackmail if the murder for hire ever went wrong. I maintained a stony silence, the metallic taste of adrenaline and exhaustion coating my tongue. "I'm not your partner anymore, Brent," I said, my voice as cold as the floor beneath us. "I'm just the man who survived you." Detective Long led me away from the noise and into a secure office where a team of federal agents and forensic accountants sat huddled over glowing monitors. They showed me the sprawling connection between Pierce's gambling debts and a major loan shark syndicate operating out of the South Side. It was a cancer that had been eating my family from the inside out. How do you weigh 2 decades of shared birthdays against one night of calculated murder? I didn't have an answer, only a clinical need for retribution. I want their names, their accounts, and their territory. I told them, my finger tracing the red lines on a digital map. "Burn it all down. This isn't just about your son anymore, Mr. Morgan," a federal agent said, his eyes reflecting the blue light of a spreadsheet. "This is about national racketeering. I provided my company's internal audit logs, effectively signing the death warrant for the syndicate's financial network. I watched as the agents began to issue warrants, feeling a grim satisfaction that every cent they moved was now a nail in their casket. The law isn't a scalpel, it's a sledgehammer, and I was the one swinging it at the foundation of my own life. As I finalized the legal affidavits to freeze the accounts Brent and Pierce had compromised, Long leaned in with a sobering update. The Loan Shark Syndicate had already placed a hit on Pierce for his failure to pay. The precinct wasn't just his prison. It was currently the only place on Earth where my son was actually safe. Is he ready to talk? I asked, my heart hollowing out until I felt like a shell of a man. He's ready to scream, Carl Long replied, placing his hand on the heavy steel door handle of Interrogation Room 4. It's time. Detective Long looked at me with a pity that hurt worse than any betrayal. He still thinks he's the victim, Carl. Don't let him win. The monitors in the precinct operations room didn't just show a police action. They displayed the systematic dismantling of the parasitic world that had been feeding on my son's soul. I sat in the dim light, the weight of the digital tablet in my hand, feeling like the only anchor in a storm of shifting images. The blue flicker of tactical helmet cams cast a ghostly light over the room as I watched law enforcement teams storm a Southside social club. These were the predators who dealt in fear and high-interest misery, now being forced into the bright glare of police searchlights. One of the raid feeds showed a safe being pried open, revealing a stash of Pierce's signed promissory notes and a ledger of Brent Rivera's kickback payments. My heart sank as I realized the syndicate uncovers a chilling depth of greed. They had even taken out a life insurance policy of their own on Pierce. They intended to kill my son once they had used him to harvest my wealth. They won't be calling in any more markers tonight, Mr. Morgan. Detective Long said, the smell of cold rain on his jacket bringing the reality of the damp Chicago night into the sterile room. Good, I replied with a clinical detachment that surprised me. They're scavengers, not businessmen. Justice isn't a feeling. It's a math problem that finally adds up to zero. Every feed I watched felt like a necessary cauterization, a burning away of the secondary rot that had surrounded my life. Long pointed at the ledger on the screen, indicating how Brent had acted as a bridge for the syndicate to eventually swallow Morgan Logistics whole. I was just a signature away from being a memory, I whispered, realization chilling my blood. I had built an empire of glass and steel, yet I had been blind to the termites eating the foundation. The static hiss of the police radio began to subside as the last of the targets were cuffed and loaded into transport vans. The operations room, once a hive of frantic energy, began to return to a heavy, expectant silence. As the raid wound down, Long's terminal let out a sharp, rhythmic ping. He leaned in, his jaw tightening. We just got a hit on Leonie Gonzalez's phone, he muttered. It was activated at a private airfield just outside the city limits. She's attempting a solo escape, Carl. She's leaving her pawns behind to burn. When the world stops screaming for blood, why does the silence feel even more dangerous? I stood up, the adrenaline that had sustained me for hours receding to leave a hollow, aching exhaustion. The external predators were in cages, but the man who truly broke my heart was still waiting for me behind a slab of reinforced steel. The wolves are in cages, I told Long, my voice cracking, but my resolve hardening. But my son is still a wolf. I walked toward the hallway, each step echoing against the linoleum. I reached Interrogation Room 4, stopping before the heavy windowless door. I'm ready, Detective. Open the door. The heavy, echoing thud of the steel door being unbolted vibrated through the floor and up into my bones. Long nodded to the uniformed officer at the door, and as the heavy latch clicked open, I realized that for all my power, I had never been more terrified of a single room. I stepped into the room, and for the first time in 6 years, I didn't see the son I'd raised. I saw a cornered predator with my eyes and his biological mother's capacity for cruelty. The harsh, unblinking glare of the interrogation lamp reflected off the metal table, casting long, skeletal shadows against the gray walls. I sat down heavily, the cold, unyielding texture of the chair biting into my back. Pierce didn't look at me with remorse. He looked at me with a sharp, defensive hatred that seemed to vibrate in the stagnant air, which was thick with the smell of sour sweat and the metallic tang of fear. "You should have stayed in the fire, Carl." He spat, his voice a jagged edge that cut through the silence. I leaned forward slightly, the red recording light reflecting in my glasses like a miniature sun. "I'm still your father, Pierce," I said, my voice steady despite the visceral heartbreak clawing at my throat. "That hasn't changed, even if the house did." He erupted, then reciting the lies Leonie had fed him as if they were holy scripture. He revealed that she had given him a specific piece of evidence, the silver coin, claiming it was the only thing she had left when I supposedly ripped the baby from her arms. "She told me everything. You stole me from her bedside while she was too weak to fight." He screamed, slamming his palms against the table. "You're not a savior. You're a kidnapper with a better tailor. Every luxury you gave me was just a bribe to keep me from asking the questions you were too cowardly to answer. How do you reason with a man who has traded 30 years of reality for 2 months of poison?" I remained unnervingly still, absorbing every insult and accusation without flinching. I watched the way his hands shook, the exact same tremor I had noticed in Brent earlier that morning. It was the frantic vibration of a man realizing his foundation might be made of sand. I noticed a small, cheap locket around his neck, a tawdry piece of tin that Leonie likely used to convince him of their eternal bond. It was the physical mark of a cult-like manipulation I had been too blind to see. He sneered at my silence, his breathing heavy and rhythmic, like a wounded animal waiting for the final blow. "Are you finished, Pierce?" I asked softly, my calm acting as a vacuum for his explosive anger. The lies were afire, and he was still trying to burn me with them, unaware that I had been forged in the very furnace he helped light. "Because Leonie didn't tell you the most important part of the story," I continued. I saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes, a tiny crack in the armor of his indignation. He clutched that cheap locket as if it could shield him from the truth. But the story he built his hatred on was already beginning to smoke. I leaned forward, the shadows of the room deepening around us, and reached into my pocket for the one piece of paper that would prove my son had been hunting a ghost for a woman who never existed. I needed him to see the weight of the paper, the faded ink of a truth that predated his rage. This wasn't about money or empires anymore. It was about the simple, devastating facts of a cardboard box and a cold hospital floor. I smoothed the yellowed police report onto the cold metal table, the ink from 1996, staring back at us like an unblinking eye that saw exactly what Leonie wanted to forget. The paper was brittle, the smell of old acidic paper rising between us as I forced Pierce to look at the official record of his own beginning. "She told you I was a thief, Pierce," I said, my voice dropping to a somber, hollow tone. "But this report says I was a witness." I pointed to the officer's clinical description of a discarded infant in a produce box found behind the hospital's loading dock, not a nursery or a mother's bedside. "Look at the timestamp. You had been alone in the rain next to a dumpster for 4 hours before I found you. Leonie didn't have you stolen by a billionaire. She left you because a baby didn't fit her lifestyle at 20. Pierce stared at the paper, his aggressive fire finally dying out, replaced by a sobering, cold reality. I recounted the emotional truth of that night, how I had just lost Sarah and was wandering the hospital grounds in a daze when I heard your faint cry. I described the physical sensation of picking up that damp cardboard and seeing a heartbeat in a box. I didn't take you, Pierce. I was the only one who didn't walk away. You weren't a legacy to me then. You were just a reason to live again. The truth isn't a bandage. It's the surgical knife that cuts out the rot, and right now my son was bleeding out on the floor. I watched as he looked at the cheap silver coin he had carried like a talisman. I revealed that it wasn't a family heirloom Leonie had kept for 30 years. I found the receipt in Brent's shredded files, I explained. He bought it at a pawn shop 3 months ago just to help Leonie sell the lie. The sound of the locket's cheap metal clinking against the metal table felt like a gunshot in the absolute silence. Pierce's worldview was shattering the weight of his attempted parricide, based entirely on a grifter's fiction, beginning to crush him. She said you paid the nurses to hide the records. He whispered, a blur of tears finally filling his eyes. She said what she needed to say to get your hands on my throat, I replied. Can you imagine the weight of realizing you tried to kill the only man who ever truly chose you? I watched as the sudden sharp drop in the room's temperature seemed to hit him, his entire body beginning to tremble. He realized that the emergency exit Leonie promised him after the fire was actually a setup to have him arrested or killed, ensuring she kept the entire insurance payout for herself while she fled from a private airfield. He was never her son. He was just her final score. Pierce reached for the locket around his neck, his fingers trembling so violently he nearly tore the chain from his throat. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a hollow, haunting realization that made him look like the abandoned child I'd found all those years ago. He looked up at me, his face a mask of total psychological collapse, and whispered one word that I hadn't heard in 6 long years. Dad. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the sound of a heart finally breaking under the weight of the truth. The word Dad didn't feel like a homecoming. It felt like a ghost limb twitching after an amputation, a reminder of a life we both could have had if greed hadn't set our world on fire. The sound of Pierce's forehead hitting the cold, abrasive metal table as he finally started to weep was a dull thud that echoed through the small room like a closing door. His facade of corporate arrogance had completely liquidated, leaving only a broken, hysterical man who looked less like a mogul and more like a frightened boy. I thought I was reclaiming my life. He sobbed, his voice muffled by the steel beneath him. But I was just throwing it away. She made the hate feel like it was the only thing I had left that was real. I sat in silence for a long moment, the salt sting of tears on my own cheek catching the bright, clinical glare of the precinct lights. I watched him confess to the moments of hesitation that Leonie had ruthlessly suppressed. He admitted that Brent Rivera had actually offered to help him flee the country before the fire, but Leonie had blocked it. She insisted I had to die for the cycle to break. Pierce choked out. Can you love the monster while still demanding the cage stay locked? I slowly reached across the table, my hand hovering in the stagnant air before finally resting on Pierce's shaking shoulder. The texture of his expensive coat felt alien against my palm. I am still your father, Pierce, I whispered, my vision blurring. And because I am, I have to let you face what you've done. I can forgive you as a parent, but as a citizen, I have to testify. The love that picked you up in the rain 30 years ago hasn't died, but it can no longer shield you from the truth. Pierce looked at me with a mix of shame and a newfound, terrifying clarity. The heavy steel door groaned open, and Detective Long stepped in the smell of ozone and wet pavement, following him into the room. The handcuffs didn't make a sound, but they felt like the loudest thing in the world as they snapped shut around Pierce's wrists. Don't leave me, Dad, Pierce pleaded as the officers pulled him to his feet. I'm the only one who didn't leave Pierce, I replied, standing at the interrogation door. I'm just the only one who can't follow you where you're going. As the officers led him away, he leaned back toward me, his eyes wide with a final chilling revelation. He whispered that Leonie has a second son, another Mark she's currently grooming in another city, another legacy she's preparing to harvest. I stood in the hollow, echoing hallway and watched the elevator doors swallow the only family I had left. Long approached me, his face grim, and handed me a final file. Leonie Gonzalez hadn't just fled. She had left behind a sophisticated digital trail leading directly to my own offshore accounts, a parting gift designed to frame me for my own son's crimes. I watched his heels click against the linoleum as he moved toward the processing desk, realizing that while I had saved the boy from the box once this time, he was the only one who could find a way back from the dark. I watched the woman who shared my son's blood walk into the courtroom, and I realized that while I had spent 30 years building a family, she had spent them perfecting the art of the harvest. I sat in the back of the Cook County Courthouse, the cold, abrasive feel of the gallery bench anchoring me to a reality I still struggled to accept. The room was grand, filled with the smell of old wood and furniture polish, but the air felt heavy and stagnant. Leonie Gonzalez entered shackled at the wrists and ankles. The rhythmic clink of her shackles was a lonely metallic sound that echoed against the high ceilings where dust motes danced in the sharp shafts of light from the windows. She wore an orange jumpsuit that made her look smaller, but the calculate's coldness in her eyes hadn't diminished an inch. She looked at the judge's bench like it was a minor inconvenience in a long career of wreckage. And when her gaze finally landed on me, she offered a smirk that felt like a physical blow. The prosecution began detailing her history, revealing a second mark. Leonie had already contacted a wealthy adopted daughter in Seattle while she was still coaching Pierce on how to burn me alive. How do you sentence a woman for the crime of hollowing out a man's heart from the inside? I listened, the metallic taste of suppressed anger coating my tongue, as they described how she used Pierce's adoption trauma as a crowbar to pry open his loyalty. Every message she sent to him was a drop of poison in a 30-year-old well, systematically turning my son into a weapon. The prosecutor presented the digital trail she left, the clumsy attempt to frame me for the conspiracy, as the final proof of her sociopathy. She didn't just want the money, Carl, I thought, staring at the back of her head. She wanted to destroy the man who took her property. As the judge prepared to hand down the maximum sentence, I watched her carefully. Her eyes weren't empty. They were just full of numbers. When she finally spoke, it wasn't to apologize, or even to defend herself. She asked only about the status of her frozen accounts, her voice clinical and detached. I realized with a sickening clarity that she didn't care about Pierce the Fire or the lives she had turned to ash. To her, this was just a failed business transaction. Is that all? I whispered to the empty space beside me. Pierce was never a son to her, just a high-yield asset that had failed to mature. She didn't lose a son today, she just lost a commission. As the bailiffs began to lead her out, she paused near my row. The smirk returned sharper this time. She leaned in and whispered a final taunt that made the blood in my veins turn to ice. She told me she wasn't the one who found Pierce. She claimed Brent Rivera had been paying her a monthly retainer for 10 years to keep her as a weapon in reserve. I stood as the courtroom cleared the weight of Brent's 10-year retainer, feeling like a new fire starting in my gut. And I realized the betrayal was even deeper than the police had imagined. I had been living in a house of cards, and the man holding the fan was the person I had called my brother for half a lifetime. I sat in the front row, watching my life's work and my family's legacy being weighed in years and months, wondering how 15 years of a son's life could ever balance out 30 years of a father's love. The heavy silence of the courtroom was a physical weight, broken only by the smell of floor wax and old wood. Brent Rivera was sentenced first. He stood there stripped of his dignity and his expensive silk suit, attempting one last pathetic plea for leniency. I was just trying to keep the company solvent. He claimed, his voice a frantic rasp. The judge looked at him with a coldness that mirrored my own. You were trying to keep your head above water in a pool of your own making, Mr. Rivera, the judge replied, referencing the monthly retainer Brent had paid to Leonie for a decade. Brent tried to turn on Pierce one last time, accusing the boy of being the true mastermind, but the judge quickly shut him down. She revealed that Pierce had already provided a full documented confession that protected my remaining assets from Leonie's digital frame-up. I watched with cold detachment as my former best friend was sentenced to 20 years for corporate embezzlement and conspiracy to commit murder. Brent's fear finally outweighed his greed, his knees buckling as the bailiffs took hold of him. The judge's gavel didn't sound like a tool of justice. It sounded like the lid of a coffin closing on the last 30 years of my life. Then Pierce was brought forward. He looked hollowed out and fragile in his prison blues. The harsh yellow glare of the afternoon sun through the high windows, highlighting every line of exhaustion on his young face. The judge acknowledged the psychological manipulation by Leonie and Brent, but she emphasized that Pierce's own hand had triggered the sequence of events. "Do you have anything to say, Mr. Morgan?" she asked. Pierce looked at the floor, his voice a mere whisper. "No, Your Honor." He was sentenced to 15 years in a high-security facility. The number hung in the air like a physical blow to my chest. 15 years. With good behavior, he would be eligible for parole in 10. I felt the weight of that decade pressing against my ribs. I am 61 years old now. In 10 years, if I am still here, I will be 71. The heavy, starched collar of my shirt pressing against my neck made it hard to swallow. Justice is a cold comfort when the person paying the price is the one you would have died for. As the bailiffs began to lead him toward the side door, Pierce stopped for a fraction of a second. He looked directly at me, and in his eyes I saw no anger left, only a profound, silent apology that I felt in my very marrow. I noticed he was clutching something in his hand, a small worn photograph of the two of us from a decade ago. He had finally discarded Leonie's locket. I didn't say a word, but I mouthed the promise I had made since he was a baby. "I'll be waiting, Pierce." He didn't speak, but the way he looked at the door before being led away told me he knew exactly what he'd lost. I remained seated long after the room cleared, the echo of the gavel still ringing in the empty gallery. A decade felt like both an eternity and the blink of an eye. I walked out of the courthouse and saw Otis waiting by the car, and I realized that while one family had ended today, another had just begun to breathe. I pressed my thumb against the biometric scanner of the new front door, and for the first time in my life, the light flashed green for a man who had finally stopped running from his own history. The charred smell of the brownstone site, even months later, had been the only thing that felt real, but today it was replaced by the clean, sharp scent of fresh cedar and white paint. As I stepped inside, I found a small, fire-damaged letter tucked into the back of a restored grandfather clock. It was from Sarah, written shortly before she died, encouraging me to find the beauty in what is left behind. It was a message from the past that I finally felt worthy of reading. I walked through the sterile, quiet halls of the reconstructed home, the architecture echoing the old layout, but the spirit of the place had been fundamentally altered. There were no hidden safes now, no internal security overrides accessible to anyone but me. "It looks the same," I whispered, to the silence of a house that was no longer haunted, "but it feels lighter. A house is just a box, until you decide what is worth keeping inside." I moved into the living room, standing before the mantel where the nightmare had begun. The cold, smooth touch of marble on the mantel felt grounded under my fingertips. I began to curate the space with surgical precision. I placed the framed photo of Sarah in the center, her smile a steady anchor. Next to it, I set a small restored toy truck that Pierce had loved as a child, a relic of the boy I had raised, not the man he had become. Finally, I reached into my pocket and felt the heavy, comforting weight of a single silver coin in my palm. It wasn't the pawn shop forgery Brent had used to destroy my family, but the original token of gratitude Otis had returned to me. I placed it on the marble, a testament to a janitor's loyalty. If a man loses his son but finds his soul, is he still a billionaire or just a beggar who got lucky? I looked at a photo of Brent that had survived the soot. "You stay here," I muttered, sliding the frame into a deep drawer. "You belong in the dark. I am done hoarding ghosts." I walked to the study window, the room bathed in the golden, hazy light of a Chicago sunset. Outside, I saw Otis Henderson stepping out of a car with his son. I had hired the young man to head my private security. I knew now that blood didn't guarantee protection, but shared history did. The fire didn't take everything I thought as I poured a glass of water. It just cleared the brush. The ashes are gone. The air is clear. I realized I had transferred a majority of my non-voting shares into a trust for Otis's grandchildren. My empire would no longer be a monument to my own name, but a fuel for the loyalty that had saved it. "Welcome home, Carl," I whispered to my reflection in the glass. I watched the sun set over the city, knowing that tomorrow I would visit the prison not as a victim, but as a father who finally knew how to tell his son the truth about the day he found him. The cycle of the harvest was over, and for the first time in 30 years, the ground felt solid beneath my feet. I stood at the podium in the same boardroom, where Brent and Pierce once plotted my end, looking out at a room full of people who finally saw me not as a giant to be toppled, but as a man who had learned to walk in the ash. The morning gala at Morgan Logistics was thick with the smell of expensive coffee and morning pastries, but the atmosphere was surprisingly somber. I chose transparency over corporate spin, detailing the betrayal not to shame my son, but to explain why we were pivoting away from ruthless expansion. I revealed that the funding for our new direction comes directly from the liquidated assets of Brent Rivera and Leonie Gonzalez, essentially turning the conspirators' greed into the community's grace. Our legacy isn't built on what we take, but on what we refuse to let go of. I told the board the bright, clinical reflection of the boardroom table shimmering beneath the lights. From this day forward, Morgan Logistics doesn't just move freight. We move the needle on mercy. I announced a multi-million-dollar endowment aimed at legal and medical assistance for families in the South Side, the very community that birthed the men who saved my life. After the speech, I retreated to my private office for a meeting that meant more to me than any merger. Otis and Silas were waiting, and the air between us was heavy with a shared, silent history. I presented Otis with the deed to a new home and a senior advisory role. "You saved me from a fire, Otis. It's only fair I save you from the rent," I said, feeling the warm, steady weight of a handshake from a man who had been my guardian in the dark. If the man who has everything finally gives it away, does he become empty, or is he finally full? I turned to Silas, offering him the leadership of a new security firm, fully funded and vetted by Detective Long. "I'm not giving you a job, Silas. I'm giving you a fortress for your family," I promised. It was a legitimate path for him to protect the daughter he almost lost. Later, I sat with my legal team to sign the charter for the foundations for a second chance. The scratch of a fountain pen on heavy parchment was a rhythmic, comforting sound in the quiet office. The program was designed to identify and support abandoned talents, the ones the system usually ignores. "I want to find the babies in the boxes before they grow up and decide to set the world on fire," I instructed my attorneys. "Make sure the criteria are broad. We're looking for heart, not just history." I realized that the cardboard box I was found in wasn't a death sentence. It was the start of a lineage of survivors. The ink on the page was black, but it felt like light. As I finished the signing, Otis leaned in his voice a low rumble of affection. He revealed that his son's middle name is Carl, a secret he had kept for 5 years. It was the final proof that our bond was always family even before the first spark flew. As I handed the final signed document to my attorney, the vibrating hum of a phone against my wooden desk broke the silence. My phone buzzed with an incoming collect call from the state penitentiary, the one call I had been waiting 6 months to take. My breath caught in my throat as I reached for the device, knowing the final debt was about to be addressed. The voice on the other end of the line was thin, stripped of the arrogance that once filled my boardrooms, sounding more like the echo of a ghost than the man who had tried to turn me into one. I pressed the phone to my ear, listening to the static, heavy hum of a prison phone line that served as the only umbilical cord left between us. I had spent several weeks waiting for this moment, steeling myself for anger or silence, but the reality was far more fragile. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Dad Pierce whispered. I wanted to hear a voice that wasn't a lie. I looked down at the documents for my new foundation, realizing that the work of rebuilding a son from the rubble of a betrayal had only just begun. I have set up a secret educational trust for Silas Ward's daughter as part of my new scholarship fund, ensuring that the former hitman's difficult sacrifice resulted in a legitimate legacy for his own child. It was a private act of mercy that mirrored the public ones I was now performing daily. "I'll send the book you asked for, Pierce," I said, my voice thick with a pensive weight. "I'll send whatever you need to find yourself again." In the weeks that followed, I established a new daily rhythm that revolved around redemption and the scent of fresh ink on high-quality stationery. My mornings were spent in the study where the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall provided a steady cadence to my work. I sat at my desk feeling the cool, smooth texture of scholarship certificates for the children of incarcerated parents. A scholarship isn't a gift, I reminded myself. It is an investment in a future that wasn't supposed to happen. Time in a prison cell is a slow drip of acid, but out here it's the steady beat of a heart that refused to stop. Every Tuesday I committed myself to a discipline of memory. I wrote letters to Pierce detailing the mundane beauty of the garden growing back, or the way the Chicago wind felt against the new glass of the brownstone. I was choosing to share the small parts of a life he nearly destroyed, to ground him in a reality he had once forsaken. "I am writing to tell you the garden is blooming." I wrote the scratch of my pen, the only sound in the room. "It's growing back just like we are." As spring turned to early summer, I found myself standing before a discreet calendar in my study. I looked at the release date circled in red, calculating the 10-year horizon. I would be 71 years old when those gates finally opened. I didn't lose a son. I just put him in a very expensive, very secure waiting room. The physical toll of the next decade would be immense for both of us. But I accepted the quiet of the house as a preparation for the man my son might eventually become. 10 years is a long time to be alone. I whispered to the empty air, but it's a short time to build a soul. I'll be here when the gates open. I'm not going anywhere. I received a letter from the warden that June, stating that Pierce had officially refused all visitors except for me. He had finally cut the last psychological thread Leonie had woven into his mind. I looked at the empty chair across from my desk and realized that for the first time in 30 years, I wasn't protecting a secret or a company. I was simply waiting for my family to come home. The metal detector let out a flat, indifferent chirp as I stepped through, stripped of my watch and my cufflinks, entering the only place in the world where the name Carl Morgan meant absolutely nothing. The cold, antiseptic smell of the prison lobby clung to my throat as I followed a silent guard toward the visitation room. I was no longer a billionaire protecting an empire. I was simply a man waiting to see his son. I entered the room, a sterile environment defined by gray plastic and the rhythmic thud of heavy steel doors. Pierce was already sitting on the other side of the reinforced glass. The sharp edges of his previous arrogance had been sanded down, replaced by a weary, quiet stillness that made him look younger and older all at once. I noticed his pale, unmanicured hands resting on the counter, a far cry from the hands that once signed million-dollar deals. He revealed that he has started working in the prison's library, teaching other inmates to read. It was a humble echo of the values I had tried to instill in him for decades, a small spark of light in the gray. We both reached for our respective handsets, at the same time the hollow plastic click of the connection, sounding like the first stone laid in a new foundation. "You look tired, Dad," he whispered. "I've lived through a fire and a courtroom, Pierce." I replied, my voice steady. "I've earned the right to be tired. If the glass between us is the only thing keeping the world together, is it a barrier or a bridge?" I spoke to him about the Second Chance Foundation and my visits to the old hospital dock. I wanted him to understand that while I couldn't undo his sentence, I would be the lighthouse that guided him back to shore. "I chose you when you were a heartbeat in a box," I said, leaning toward the glass. "And I choose you now in this cage. My love was never a business transaction or a bribe for your loyalty. I don't need a legacy, Pierce. I just need my son." He pressed his palm against the glass, and for a moment the divide seemed to vanish. As the guard signaled the end of our time, I watched him be led away, but the bitterness was gone. I walked back to the parking lot, feeling the warmth of the afternoon sun on the steering wheel as I began the drive home. Choices aren't made in the light. They are forged in the dark. I reflected on the nature of our lives. How Leonie chose to leave, Brent chose to betray, but Otis and Silas chose to protect. We are not defined by the boxes we are found in, but by the hands we choose to hold when the fire starts. We are the sum of the people we choose to save. The fire is out, but the light is just beginning. I didn't drive back to the brownstone immediately. Instead, I pulled up to a simple, quiet diner on the south side. I sat at a corner table with Otis sharing a meal in a silence that was finally comfortable. The man who had everything finally found what he actually needed. I looked at Otis across the table and realized that the greatest empire I ever built wasn't made of steel, it was made of the people who stayed when everything else burned. Looking back at everything that happened, I realized the greatest mistake I made wasn't building a powerful company. It was believing that success alone could protect the people I loved. I spent years guarding money secrets and reputation, but I forgot that truth and humility matter more than control. This painful family story taught me that silence can become poison when the people we love are left alone with lies. If there is one lesson I want you to take from this family story, it is this: don't hide the truth from the people you love even when you believe you're protecting them. Secrets create shadows where manipulation can grow. What happened to me may look like a dramatic dad revenge, but the truth is, I never wanted revenge. I wanted my son to find his way back before hatred destroyed him completely. Sometimes life turns into a dad revenge story, not because a father seeks vengeance, but because he refuses to abandon his child to darkness. This family story reminds me that loyalty is not measured by blood alone, but by the people who stand beside you when everything burns. And through all of it, I believe God allowed me to walk through this fire, so I could understand that mercy is stronger than anger. In the end, this wasn't just a story about betrayal. It became a quiet dad revenge against despair itself. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. Please share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if you were in Carl's position, facing a betrayal like this from your own child? I would truly value hearing your perspective. If this story moved, you consider subscribing so you don't miss future stories of justice and redemption. A gentle note: while this narrative draws inspiration from real-life themes about family conflict and trust, certain elements were dramatized for storytelling purposes. If this type of story isn't for you, feel free to explore other videos that may suit you better.